July 28th, 2026. Let's get right into it, because this is one of those stories where the headline undersells what actually happened. A Ukrainian F-16 picked a fight with a Russian Su-35, one of the most advanced fighters Moscow has ever put in the sky, and the Su-35 lost. Not to a missile battery, not to a lucky SAM shot, but to a single-engine jet that critics have spent 2 years calling too outdated, too limited, and too outmatched to ever do this. We haven't seen a confirmed F-16 air-to-air kill like this since the aircraft arrived in Ukrainian service back in August of 2024. And now that it's finally happened, the story behind it is even wilder than the headline. Before we get into exactly how this went down, stick around, because later on we're going to break down the actual missile, the actual radar, and the actual tactics that made this kill possible. And then we're going to talk about what Russia is now trying to spin the story into, because their reaction alone tells you everything about how much this stings. So let's start with how the world actually found out. On July 21st, in a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing that was supposed to be about a nearly $1 trillion supplemental defense budget request, General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dropped a line almost as a side comment that instantly became the biggest story in the air war. He was asked about years of stalled air defense funding for Ukraine. And instead of just giving a dry budget answer, he said something that made half the room sit up straight. He said, and this is close to word for word, that Ukraine had recently achieved its first air-to-air engagement in which an F-16 shot down a Russian fighter. He framed it as proof that Ukraine's layered air defense network has matured, that the country isn't just surviving in the air, it's starting to actively hunt. 30 seconds. That's about how long it took for that one sentence to turn into headlines across every defense outlet on Earth. Because here's the thing, this wasn't just any kill. This was the first time since Ukraine started flying F-16s that a Ukrainian F-16 was officially and publicly credited by a senior American general with destroying a Russian jet in the air. Not a drone, not a cruise missile, a fighter jet, fighter versus fighter, in a war where actual dogfights are almost a myth at this point because both sides have built such dense, overlapping surface-to-air missile networks that pilots mostly stay glued to their own side of the front line and shoot at each other from a distance, instead of turning and burning like it's 1986. So if you're picturing some kind of close-in canopy-to-canopy duel with missiles crossing paths in a tight turn, that's not what this was, and that's actually part of what makes it interesting. This was a modern kill, which means sensors, timing, and networks mattered just as much as the pilot's hands on the stick. Here's where the story actually starts, though, because Kane wasn't announcing something brand new. He was confirming something that had already happened 13 days earlier and had been sitting in a fog of speculation the entire time. Rewind back to July 8th. Ukraine's Air Force publicly reported that a Russian jet had gone down over the eastern sector, but in that first announcement, they deliberately did not say what shot it down. That detail, whether it was a ground-based Patriot battery or an airborne kill from an F-16, was withheld, and in a war being fought as much on Telegram as it is in the sky, that silence created a full 2 weeks of dueling narratives. On the Russian side, a pro-war channel with deep, well-documented ties to frontline Russian aerospace units, one that has a habit of being unusually blunt about Russian losses even while cheerleading the war, confirmed almost immediately that the jet in question was a Su-35S flanker, and reported that the pilot had ejected and been rescued. That's actually a notable detail, because it means whatever hit that jet hit it hard enough and fast enough that the pilot needed to punch out over contested territory, not glide it home for a soft landing. But almost as soon as that admission went out, other Russian pro-war channels started walking it back into a more comfortable story. Their revised version claimed the Su-35 hadn't been shot down by an F-16 at all, but had instead been destroyed by a Patriot air defense system after supposedly getting tangled up in an aerial engagement with Ukrainian jets. In other words, blame the missile battery, not the fighter. Now, why would that distinction matter so much to them? Because losing a jet to a Patriot is one kind of story. Losing a jet in a straight-up fighter engagement to an aircraft that Russian state media has spent 2 years mocking as an obsolete hand-me-down is an entirely different kind of story. And it's the kind of story that's much harder to spin into anything other than embarrassing. So for almost 2 weeks, that's where things sat. Ukraine wasn't confirming the platform. Russia was busy rewriting its own version of events in real time. And then General Kane, testifying in front of the United States Senate, essentially settled the argument by accident in the middle of a budget hearing, almost as a footnote to a different question entirely. Ukrainian defense outlets moved fast to connect the dots, identifying the aircraft lost that day as a Su-35S Flanker E, and confirming that Kane's statement was almost certainly referring to that exact same engagement from July 8th. Now, here's the part where the sarcasm writes itself. For 2 weeks, Russian channels quietly tried to rewrite a fighter jet loss into a ground-based accident. No evidence, no wreckage photos supporting it, no radar data, just a convenient story that happened to remove the F-16 from the equation entirely. And then the actual chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff stands up in front of Congress and says, no, actually, it was the F-16. Shocker. It's almost like when a Su-35 goes down, the first instinct in Moscow isn't to figure out what happened, it's to figure out which version of what happened makes the story less painful. It's a pattern you see over and over in this war. Something goes wrong for Russia, and within hours, there are at least 2 or 3 competing explanations floating around before the dust even settles, usually landing anywhere except on the possibility that Ukraine simply won a fair fight. A missile battery gets the blame instead of a fighter jet. A mechanical failure gets floated instead of a successful intercept. Sometimes it's outright silence, just letting a story quietly disappear from the news cycle and hoping nobody circles back to it. And to be fair, it almost worked here. If a random general hadn't casually mentioned it in a budget hearing 13 days later, there's a real chance this story stays permanently filed under unconfirmed. One more entry in a long list of telegram rumors nobody ever definitively resolves. Instead, it became one of the most talked about air-to-air engagements of the entire war, essentially because Russia's own attempt to bury the story made the eventual confirmation land even harder. If you're new here, a quick reminder before we go further. If you're finding value in breakdowns like this, dropping a like actually helps push this kind of analysis to more people who are trying to make sense of what's happening in this war. And subscribing means you don't miss it when the next one of these stories breaks, because these things move fast, and the real explanation usually shows up buried in a Senate hearing transcript, not a headline. Now let's talk about what actually makes this specific kill so significant, because it's not just that a Su-35 went down. Su-35s have gone down before. Open source tracking groups have documented somewhere in the range of 15 to 22 Su-35s and Su-30 SM-2 losses since the start of the full-scale invasion, out of a fleet that started around 100 to 120 aircraft and has been partially replenished at a rate of roughly 8 to 12 new airframes a year out of the Komsomolsk-on-Amur plant. So Russia losing a Su-35 isn't rare. What's rare, what's actually historic here, is the platform that did it, because the Su-35S is not some leftover Cold War relic. It is, on paper, one of the most dangerous non-stealth fighters on the planet. It's a heavily modernized evolution of the old Su-27 flanker line, built specifically as Russia's bridge aircraft while the Su-57 stealth program limped along. It runs on twin AL-41F1S engines producing about 142 kilonewtons of thrust each, with three-dimensional thrust vectoring nozzles that let it perform maneuvers most Western pilots only see in airshow videos, things like the Pugachev's Cobra, where the jet's nose rears up almost past vertical while the aircraft keeps flying forward, or the Kulbit, a full loop performed almost in place. It cruises up near Mach 2.25 at altitude, carries the powerful Urbis-E passive electronically scanned array radar that can track multiple aerial targets simultaneously at long range, and it's paired with an infrared search and track system that lets it hunt passively without even switching on a radar signal that an opponent could detect and react to. Put simply, the Su-35 is built to see you before you see it, and outturn you if it ever gets close. It is, by a wide margin, the most capable operational fighter Russia has been willing to risk over Ukrainian airspace in numbers, and an F-16, by comparison, is the jet a lot of online commentary has spent 2 years calling a hand-me-down, a fourth-generation airframe that first flew in the 1970s, arriving in Ukraine only in August of 2024 after years of political delay, and showing up without some of the newest missiles, without full squadron numbers, and for a while without even enough sidewinders to go around. So, when that matchup goes the other way, when the jet everyone assumed was the underdog puts a missile into the jet everyone assumed was untouchable, that's not a footnote. That's the kind of result that should make Russian mission planners nervous every single time they send a Su-35 anywhere near the contact line from now on. Let's actually walk through how this probably happened. Because even though the finer details of the engagement haven't been made public, the pieces we do know line up into a pretty clear picture, and honestly, it's more impressive than a simple dogfight would have been. Ukrainian F-16s fly with a mixed air-to-air loadout of AIM-120 AMRAAMs for beyond visual range shots, and AIM-9 sidewinders for anything that gets in closer, with the newer AIM-9X variants able to be cued through a helmet-mounted sighting system, so a pilot can look at a target and let the missile follow the pilot's eyes instead of just the nose of the jet. The AMRAAM itself is a fire-and-forget weapon, meaning once it's launched, its own onboard radar guides it home while the launching pilot is already free to turn and run. No need to keep pointing at the target the whole time like older missiles required. Depending on the exact variant Ukraine is flying with, that missile can realistically reach out somewhere around 60 to over 100 miles under the right conditions, though real combat engagement ranges tend to run shorter once you factor in altitude, closing speed, and how hard the target is maneuvering. It's worth appreciating just how much technology is packed into a missile that weighs a little over 350 pounds and stretches roughly 12 feet long. Inside that airframe is an active radar seeker, meaning the missile itself is essentially flying its own miniature fighter jet computer, scanning for the target, adjusting its own flight path, and detonating through a proximity fuse that doesn't even need a direct hit, just close enough for the blast fragmentation warhead to shred the target aircraft. Each one of these missiles costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million, which is exactly why Ukrainian pilots don't waste them on cheap drones if they can help it, saving the far less expensive Sidewinders for that job instead and reserving the AMRAAM for targets that actually justify the price tag. The Su-35S absolutely justifies that price tag. And that's not a small technical footnote either, because for a long stretch after F-16s first arrived, Ukraine was dealing with a genuine shortage problem, at one point reportedly down to a startlingly small handful of Sidewinder missiles spread across the entire fleet, a shortfall that only got patched up when additional missiles arrived from undisclosed partners. Picture that for a second, a modern fighter jet, fully capable, fully trained pilot in the seat, and not enough missiles in the country to arm every available aircraft the way you'd want. That's the kind of unglamorous supply chain problem that never makes it into a highlight reel, but absolutely shapes whether a story like this one is even possible in the first place. Every AMRAAM Ukraine has in inventory today exists, because someone, somewhere, kept signing contracts and keeping production lines running specifically so a moment like July 8th could eventually happen. But a missile is only as good as the targeting picture that leads up to the shot. And that's where this story gets genuinely interesting. Because Ukraine's air war in 2026 isn't just about which jet has the shinier missile anymore. It's about the network behind the jet. Since the F-16s arrived, Ukraine has been steadily building what amounts to a layered networked air picture, pulling together ground-based Patriot batteries, long-range radar coverage, and Link 16 tactical data link connectivity that lets multiple sensors, whether that's a radar site, a Patriot battery, or another aircraft, feed targeting information into the same shared picture in real time. That means an F-16 pilot doesn't necessarily need to be the one who first spots the threat on radar. The threat can already be tracked, identified, and handed off before the pilot ever needs to light up his own radar and give away his position. In this specific engagement, the working assessment is that a Patriot radar picked up the Su-35 first, and that positioning likely forced the Russian pilot to stay outside the Patriot's known engagement envelope to avoid getting shot down by the ground battery, which in turn may have funneled the flanker into a predictable flight path. Ukraine may also have had support from a Swedish-donated ASC-890 airborne early warning aircraft, essentially a flying radar and command post, feeding additional tracking data into the same network, though that particular detail hasn't been officially confirmed. Combine a ground radar that boxes the enemy jet into a known lane, a potential airborne early warning platform quietly building the picture from altitude, and a data link system tying it all together, and by the time the F-16 pilot actually needs to use his own radar, he's not searching blind, he's confirming a target that the network has already been tracking. That's not a fair fight in the traditional sense. That's exactly the kind of fight modern air forces are built to win, and it's why one aging airframe with a strong network behind it can absolutely put a missile through the side of a jet that's faster, stealthier on its own sensors, and far more maneuverable in a turning fight it never actually got the chance to have. It's also worth pointing out how much irony is baked into this outcome. The Su-35's biggest advantages? Its long-range detection and its ability to outturn almost anything in a close engagement. Only matter if it actually gets into a fight on its own terms. Take away the close-in dogfight entirely, replace it with a beyond visual range engagement shaped by ground radar and data link queuing, and suddenly all that thrust vectoring and all those Cobra maneuvers are completely irrelevant. You can be the best knife fighter in the world, but it doesn't help you much if the other guy shoots you from across the room before you're anywhere near close enough to pull the knife. Think of the Su-35 as the heavyweight boxer in this matchup, all power and reach, trained for years to dominate the moment a fight gets in close. Now think of the F-16 plugged into that Ukrainian sensor network, as the guy who never actually steps into the ring at all, who instead has a spotter in the rafters calling out every move before it happens, and who lands the knockout punch from somewhere the heavyweight never saw coming. The heavyweight still has all his power. He just never got the chance to use a single ounce of it. And it's worth remembering the Su-35 didn't get built with humble ambitions. It was Russia's answer to a problem Moscow has never quite solved. How do you compete with Western air power when your true next-generation fighter keeps slipping behind schedule? The Su-57, Russia's actual fifth-generation jet, has been plagued by production delays and limited numbers for years, so the Su-35 became the stopgap, the aircraft Russia leans on specifically because it doesn't have enough real next-generation jets to go around. It's been exported to China and Egypt. It's flying with Algeria after a canceled Egyptian order got redirected there instead. And there have been long-running discussions about eventual deliveries to Iran, which would represent a real jump in capability for Tehran's aging fleet if it ever fully materializes. All of which is to say, this is not some throwaway airframe. This is the jet Russia points to when it wants to prove it can still contest the skies without needing a true fifth-generation fighter to do it. And on July 8th, it lost that argument to a jet a lot of people had already written off as obsolete. And that's really the story underneath the story here. This wasn't really Su-35 versus F-16. This was Russia's most advanced non-stealth fighter, flying largely on its own sensors and its own pilot's instincts, going up against an integrated networked air defense system that happened to have an F-16 as the final trigger puller. The airframe matters, sure, but the network mattered more. Now, let's talk about what this means going forward, because this is where it gets genuinely strategic. Russia still has real numbers on its side. Even after over a decade and a half of losses, open source estimates put Russia's operational Su-35S fleet somewhere around 80 to 100 aircraft. And production hasn't stopped, with new airframes rolling out of the Komsomolsk-on-Amur plant earlier this year, proof that Moscow can still sustain at least some level of fighter production, despite years of sanctions and battlefield attrition. So this is not a moment where Russia's advanced fighter fleet has been broken. Numerically, they're still there, and they're still dangerous. But numbers aren't the only thing that matters in an air war. Confidence matters too, and this kill puts a very real dent in it. Every Su-35 pilot flying anywhere near the front line now has to fly with the knowledge that Ukraine isn't just intercepting drones and cruise missiles anymore. It's capable of reaching out and killing a fourth-generation plus fighter jet with a networked beyond visual range shot. That changes how cautious Russian pilots have to be, how far they're willing to push toward the line of contact, and how much they can trust their own radar picture when a Patriot battery and an F-16 might already be tracking them before they even know it. Deterrence isn't only built from hardware, it's built from doubt, and this kill plants a very specific kind of doubt in the head of every Russian fighter pilot flying escort, strike, or combat air patrol missions anywhere near Ukrainian airspace from here on out. There's a broader piece to this too, because Ukraine's F-16 fleet has been going through exactly this kind of slow, uneven maturity process since it first showed up in country. Early on, pilots were flying with limited numbers of aircraft, without full missile stockpiles, and honestly, without a ton of combat experience specific to the platform. Reports throughout the past year described real shortages. At one point, a limited handful of Sidewinder missiles available across the entire fleet, which is the kind of detail that should terrify anyone who assumes Western hardware automatically means overwhelming advantage. Hardware without supply, without training, and without integration is just expensive metal sitting on a runway. What's changed since then is the integration piece, the networking, the data link, the layered radar coverage, all the unglamorous infrastructure that never makes it into a highlight reel, but is exactly what turned a lone F-16 into the tip of a much bigger spear on July 8th. And that's genuinely the story that deserves more attention than it's getting. It's not really about one missile hitting one jet. It's about the fact that 2 years into operating F-16s, Ukraine has finally built enough connective tissue between its ground radars, its air defense batteries, and its fighter fleet that the airframe itself almost becomes secondary. You could argue that if Ukraine had a squadron of even older jets plugged into this same network, this kill still happens. That's either very good news or very bad news, depending on which side of the front line you're standing on. It's easy to forget just how long it took to even get to this point. The decision to send F-16s to Ukraine wasn't some quick, obvious call. It dragged through years of political hesitation before the first jets actually touched down in August of 2024, and even after they arrived, the ramp-up was slow and, frankly, a little painful to watch from the outside. Pilots went through transition training overseas, including at bases in the United States, that also happened to sit near the same production lines, building the missiles those pilots would eventually fire in combat, which is its own strange little detail. Once you think about it, the training ground and the missile factory practically sharing a fence line. Early on, Ukraine didn't have enough airframes, didn't have deep missile stockpiles, and didn't have the layered network in place yet to make full use of the jets it did have. For a while, F-16s were mostly doing what older Soviet-era jets were already doing, flying air defense patrols, going after cruise missiles and drones during mass strikes, chipping in alongside ground-based Patriot and NASAMS batteries, rather than doing anything dramatically new. What's changed since then is everything underneath the jet. Ukraine has spent the better part of 2 years quietly stitching together its ground radar coverage, its Patriot and other air defense batteries, and its growing mix of Western fighters, which by 2026 isn't just F-16s anymore. Ukraine has also been folding in French Mirage 2000s and Rafales, along with Swedish Gripens starting to arrive. plus that Saab early warning aircraft acting as a flying radar station overhead. None of that shows up in a highlight reel. None of it is as satisfying to watch as missile cam footage of a jet going down. But it's exactly the kind of unglamorous infrastructure that turns a handful of individual fighters into one coordinated system. And it's exactly the infrastructure that made a single F-16 crew capable of pulling off what happened on July 8th. Zoom out from just this one kill for a second, because it's not happening in isolation. The same week the story broke, Russia launched one of its largest combined ballistic missile and drone barrages of the year at targets deep inside Ukraine, mixing hypersonic missiles with waves of one-way attack drones in an attempt to overwhelm exactly the kind of layered air defense network we've just been talking about. Ukraine intercepted a large share of it, but not all of it, and that tension is the whole story of this war right now. An air defense network that's mature enough to shoot down one of Russia's best fighters in a beyond visual range engagement, but still stretched thin enough that a large enough missile and drone salvo can occasionally punch through anyway. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels the other out. Before we get to the closing thought here, if this kind of breakdown is useful to you, this is exactly the kind of story that gets buried under a single headline unless someone actually walks through the testimony, the timeline, and the hardware behind it. So if you want more of this, sharing it with someone who'd find it interesting genuinely helps more than you'd think, and leaving a comment with what you think happens next actually shapes what gets covered going forward. So here's the board that's actually being drawn right now, even if nobody's talking about it directly. Russia is not going to stop flying Su-35s near the front. They can't. It's their best available non-stealth platform, and pulling it back entirely would hand Ukraine uncontested airspace in a war where air superiority already leans more contested than either side wants to admit. But every additional confirmed loss like this one raises the cost of every single sortie, and it forces Russian mission planners into a choice they don't love: either keep flying Su-35s close to the contact line and accept a slowly rising loss rate as Ukraine's network defenses mature, or pull them back further from the front and effectively cede more of that contested airspace by default. Neither option is good for Moscow. Both options are exactly what Ukraine wants. And there's a quieter signal buried in all of this too. The fact that it took a Senate budget hearing, a nearly $1 trillion funding request, and a general almost casually mentioning it in passing for the world to even learn this kill happened tells you something about how deliberately Ukraine is managing its own narrative here. They didn't hold a press conference. They didn't put out a triumphant statement. They let the story sit in ambiguity for nearly 2 weeks, while Russian channels tied themselves in knots trying to explain it away, and then they let an American general confirm it, almost by accident, in front of Congress. That's not an accident of messaging. That looks a lot like a country that has learned exactly how much more damage a quiet, confirmed fact does to enemy morale than a loud announcement ever could. There's also a funding angle sitting right underneath the surface of that same hearing that's worth sitting with for a second. Kane wasn't just there to talk about one missile shot. He was there defending a nearly $1 trillion supplemental budget request in a political environment where support for continued Ukraine funding has been anything but guaranteed, and where separate war-related resolutions have occasionally split lawmakers right down the middle. Dropping a concrete, verifiable success story, a first-of-its-kind F-16 kill, into the middle of that exact conversation is not a coincidence of timing. It's a data point that argues for itself. It's much easier to justify billions in continued military assistance when you can point to a specific engagement and say, this is what that assistance actually produces in the field: a fourth-generation jet that critics said couldn't compete, successfully hunting down one of Russia's most advanced fighters. Whether that was the deliberate intention behind the timing of Kane's remarks or simply a convenient overlap, the effect on the funding debate is the same either way. There's one more layer worth sitting with before we get to the closing thought, and it's the human one underneath all the hardware talk. Every one of these engagements, on either side, comes with a pilot strapped into a cockpit making split-second decisions with genuinely fatal stakes if any part of that decision goes wrong. The Russian pilot who ejected from that Su-35 on July 8th survived, which by the grim math of this war counts as a relatively good outcome. But Ukraine's own F-16 pilots have paid a real price flying this same mission set. Ukraine has already lost at least one F-16 and its pilot in the process of intercepting a massive incoming Russian missile and drone barrage, a pilot who reportedly shot down several targets before his own damaged aircraft went down. That's the trade being made every single time one of these jets goes up. Real people, real risk, on both sides of a front line that doesn't pause for any of it. So where does this actually go from here? Does this kill stay a one-off historic footnote, the first, and for a while, the only confirmed F-16 air-to-air victory of the war? Or is this the first data point in a pattern that starts showing up more regularly as Ukraine's networked air defenses keep maturing and more F-16s, along with the Mirage 2000s, Gripens, and additional early warning aircraft still working their way into service start operating together as one integrated system instead of a handful of individual jets? Does Russia adjust by pulling its Su-35s further back from the contact line, effectively conceding more airspace by caution rather than by force? Or do they keep pushing forward and simply accept that the cost of every sortie near the front just went up? There's also the question of what Russia does with its own messaging from here. Now that a sitting American general has publicly confirmed the F-16 as the shooter, the earlier Patriot battery version of events becomes much harder to keep circulating with a straight face. Does Russian state media quietly drop the story altogether and move on to the next news cycle, hoping people forget the two competing explanations ever existed? Or do they double down and keep pushing the ground-based version anyway? Evidence be damned, simply because admitting the F-16 story in full is too uncomfortable to sit with. Either path tells you something about how much this one engagement actually stings, because a country confident in its own air power doesn't usually need 2 weeks in a cover story to talk about a single lost jet. What do you think happens next? Drop your take in the comments, because on a story with this many moving pieces, the conversation underneath it is honestly just as interesting as the story itself. And if this breakdown helped connect the dots between a Senate hearing, a 2-week Telegram argument, and one of the most significant fighter engagements of the entire war, that's exactly the kind of story worth liking, sharing, and sticking around for the next one of, because these things keep happening, and most of them are still waiting for someone to actually walk through what they mean.